A former policy analyst in the Reagan White House, Dinesh has been called one of the top public policymakers in the country by Investors Business Daily and quickly became known as a major influencer on public policy through his writings. Since then, Dinesh has had a prominent career as a writer, scholar, and public intellectual. In his first book, Illiberal Education, publicized the phenomenon of political correctness in America's colleges and universities and became a New York Times bestseller for 15 weeks. It has been listed as one of the most influential books of the 1990s. In 1995, he published The End of Racism, which became one of the most controversial books of the time and another national bestseller. He has also become a renowned filmmaker with his top-grossing documentaries, 2016, Obama's America, and America, Imagine the World Without Her. His upcoming film, Hillary's America, is set to be released in theaters on July 25th. One of Dinesh's favorite venues for debates and speeches has been college campuses. During the past 25 years, he has appeared at hundreds of colleges and universities and has spoken with hundreds of thousands of students in these live settings. Dinesh has also been named one of America's most influential conservative thinkers by the New York Times Magazine. Please welcome Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and I want to talk to you about some very important issues that are not only roiling this campus, but are actually at the center of the political debate in America today. My topic is actually going to be justice. Justice is the primary virtue of every society. It is actually the most important political virtue. Sometimes among Republicans and conservatives, the focus is not so much on justice, it's on freedom. But to my way of thinking, justice is actually a higher virtue than freedom. Why? Because there is such a thing as legitimate deprivations of freedom. We deprive people of freedom all the time, not just kids, but adults. And if you deprive someone of freedom, the only question to ask is that reasonable? Is it a reasonable deprivation of freedom? But with justice, there's no such thing as good injustice. Injustice is always bad. And so I'm going to talk about three types of justice. Partly for autobiographical reasons, I'm going to say a word about criminal justice. I'm also going to talk about racial justice. And then I want to talk about, because it's at the center of our political debate, economic justice, which is the justice or injustice of capitalism, of free market technological capitalism. A word about myself. I arrived in the United States at the age of 17. I was an exchange student from India. In some ways, I kind of remember seeing America for the first time. It was a kind of a visual and emotional shock. I saw New York City, I saw the skyline of New York, I saw the Statue of Liberty. It was nothing I exactly saw, but it was really more the feeling that came over me that I remember the most. Just a feeling that somehow my life was going to be completely different. I had somehow moved from the margin of the world to the center. And I never lost, I still haven't lost that feeling, and it drives my politics. You know, years later, a couple years later, I was on the Dartmouth campus as an undergraduate, and I would listen in these multicultural classes as professors would say to me things like, all cultures are basically equal. No culture is superior or inferior, better or worse than any other. This is actually, you could say, multicultural doctrine. And yet, listening to it, it just didn't ring true, and not just for me. I realized that for every immigrant, this is a flat-out lie. Why? Because immigrants are naturally attached to our own country. You're born into a world, it's your family, it's your friends, it's your neighbors, it's the smells and sound. That's the only world you know. And so you are naturally anchored in it, and it's going to take a lot to make you get up, pack up, and move to another culture. And why would you do that? Unless you thought that this other culture was in some decisive, fundamental way better than the culture that you were coming from. So the immigrant, I'm saying, is a walking refutation of cultural relativism. The immigrant, in that sense, is voting with his or her feet in the most decisive way possible against his own culture and in favor of another culture. And that's why I came to America. I knew somehow, even at 17, that I would have the kind of life in America that would not be possible if I had stayed put. Now people say, well, yeah, of course, like all the immigrants, you came here because you're a Horatio Alger guy and you came for economic opportunity and that's why all the immigrants come. But I grew up in a middle-class family. And although I didn't have any great luxuries, I didn't lack for anything either. So America has, in fact, materially given me a better life, but that's not really the decisive difference. My life has changed more in other ways. If I stayed in India, I would probably have lived within a 10-mile radius of where I was born. I would have married a girl of my identical caste and socio-economic and cultural background. I would have become an engineer like my dad, a doctor like my uncle. I would have a whole set of views and opinions that could be predicted in advance. And they would be kind of what my dad believed and kind of what his dad believed before him. So what I'm saying is that my destiny would have been given to me. I'm not saying I'd have no choice, but the choice is within confined parameters. But coming to America, I see that, wow, I am the architect of my own destiny. Coming to America, I see I'm in the driver's seat of my own life. Coming to America, I see that my life is like a blank sheet of paper, and I am the artist, like you. America is pretty much the only country where if your parents say, hey, young Billy, young Jane, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they know that in the end of the day, it is you and not they who have to supply the answer to that question. So this to me is America. It's the idea of the self-directed life. Now fast forward 25 years, and here I am standing in a United States courtroom in New York City and listening to the following statement being barked out by a bailiff: the United States of America versus Dinesh D'Souza. Wow. Kind of sends a little bit of a chill down my immigrant spine. And I'm in very hostile territory because the US government, i.e. the Obama administration, has a squadron of FBI agents reading my books, going through my bank statements, looking at my tax returns for 20 years. You have no idea what it feels like to feel the United States government on your butt. It's a very unnerving feeling. And these guys were trying to put me in federal prison for up to 2 years. Now, you might say, what do you do? Well, what I did was I gave $20,000 over the campaign finance limit. The campaign finance limit is 10 grand. I gave $20,000 over the limit to a college friend of mine who was running for the Senate in New York. Now, I did it because she was part of my Dartmouth gang when I was in my teens. She was one of the first people I met in America. This was kind of my surrogate family when I got here. She was trying to get me to help her campaign in other ways. I felt really bad, so I came up with a cockamamie scheme. I told 2 of my friends, write her a check for $10,000, I'll reimburse you. Now, this is actually not allowed under the campaign finance law. So I did break the law. But no person in American history who is not corrupt has been prosecuted for doing that. In other words, normally you get prosecuted if you say to the candidate, I'll give you $20,000 under the table, you appoint me to the federal judiciary. Or, in other words, you get something out of it. Whereas in this case, I was helping a friend. She didn't even know I was doing it. So there was no prospect of gain, and there was no allegation that I was benefiting in any way. So this was an unusual case. I was sentenced as a consequence of this heinous offense to spend 8 months in a confinement center on the south part of San Diego on the Mexican border. Confinement centers, by the way, are in a way worse than federal prison, because if you go to federal prison, it's white-collar prison, which is to say mayors and city aldermen and doctors who defrauded Medicare, kind of white-collar guys. You can bring your chessboard. But in a confinement center, you know, it's hoodlums, because it's the whole gamut of criminals who are en route back to society. So if you've served 15 years for armed robbery, you go to a confinement center for 60 to 90 days, and then you're back on the street. You've served your time. But this is the transitional. So I got 8 months with these guys. Now, I wasn't in there in the day. It was overnight. So I check in at 8 p.m., out at 6 in the morning. Right about the time my case is making its way through the court, another guy, this is a guy named Sant Singh Chatwal, Asian Indian guy. We Asian Indians appear to specialize in the campaign finance violations area. Well, in any event, this character gave $180,000 in straw donations to Hillary Clinton and a whole bunch of Democratic candidates. Now, this guy was corrupt. In fact, he said, I'm trying to buy the votes of politicians. Why would they do what I want if I don't pay them? And he was also found guilty of witness tampering because he was trying to get people to lie under oath. This guy goes before a judge in New York. He gets a fine. He gets some community service. No prison. No confinement. Now, the reason I tell you this is because when we talk about justice, it's not enough to say, hey, did you break the law? I broke the law. But you also have to ask, did the penalty fit the crime? That's also part of justice. Another part of justice is, did other guys who did roughly the same thing get roughly the same penalty? If those conditions are not met, then you don't really have justice. You may put up the name justice. It may be the Department of Justice that's prosecuting you, but you're not really getting justice at all. You're getting something that is kind of a sham. And this has been a very eye-opening experience for me because, you know, being subjected to the system in this way, I mean, as an inmate, you see a different side of it. If somebody had asked me 10 years ago, had told me, in the federal prison system, in the federal judicial system, 95% of everyone accused of a crime is convicted, I would have said, so probably they go after the people who commit crimes. 95% of them are convicted because 95% of them are guilty. But when you go into the confinement center and you start talking to people about their cases and looking at their case files, you begin to realize that the whole thing is a lot more murky. And that the old civics book lesson that, you know, better that 9 guilty guys go free than 1 innocent man end up in prison, I would like to tell you that that's true, but it's not true. I'm quite convinced that there are many innocent people who are sitting in our prisons today. Why? Not because they're black, but because of the incredible power of the plea bargaining system. The plea bargaining system basically comes to you and says, we are going to accuse you of a crime. You're a doctor, for example. We're going to accuse you of administering unauthorized pain medicines. Now, this is a very gray area. You've just been administering pain medicine. Is it unauthorized? What does that mean? Well, nevertheless, if we find you guilty, you're going to spend 10 years in prison. You're going to basically destroy your life. However, if prior to trial you plead guilty, we'll give you 1 year in prison and then you're back. You can get your life back together again. Now, I would submit that it doesn't make any difference whether you're guilty or innocent. You're going to take that deal. If you're a family man, you got some kids, you got a life to come back to, you are going to plead guilty no matter whether you are guilty or not. This is our system. So I have come out of it certainly disinfected from some of my adolescent naivete about it. Criminal justice. And I want to pivot a little bit and I'll talk about economic justice first, and then I'll turn to diversity and racial justice. I want to talk about economic justice because that's the centerpiece of this whole political debate. In fact, it's the core value of the Democratic Party. Fairness, right? Here's Obama. People should pay their fair share. Now, I agree, people should pay their fair share, but here we are on a college campus and it's very reasonable to ask, what does that actually mean? Obviously, if you start with Plato's Republic, you realize that people have different definitions of fairness. So simply to say people should pay their fair share is hardly to sort out the question of what their fair share actually is. And you notice that the people who are always talking about the fair share never do. In other words, it's all right to be a liberal, but you should always think about the question, if I'm a liberal, in what society would I be a conservative? In other words, the top tax rate now is about 39%. That's the top federal rate. And you say, well, it's way too low. All these rich people are paying way too little. They should actually pay more. I want the tax rate to go up. But then I have a right to say to you, well, to what point? At what point do you think that the guy who makes $1 million a year is paying enough? Would you say that at 50% you'll be satisfied and you'll stop asking for more tax increases because we have now reached the fair share point? Notice that the progressives never do that. Their idea is more, and more, but without ever specifying what that fair point is. And I would submit that there's a reason for this. And the reason for this ultimately is that what's really going on is not any authentic examination of the moral justice of capitalism or injustice. Let's try to tackle this problem, if we can, from the root level. And from the root level, I mean from the most basic sense of the thing. So here we are in a room. Let's say we are a political community. And all of us, let's say 200 of us, so let's make it 100 to be simple. 100 of us each have $10. Total equality. We all have $10. Now, one of us, this guy right here, decides to write a book. Let's call it The Adventures of Harry Potter. And he writes the book and he offers it for sale for $2. And not all of us go for it, but many of us do. Half of us say, all right, we like this idea. Here's $2. Let's have a copy of your book. So that's 50 guys who've come up with $2. So he now has $110. Why? 50 times 2, that's 100, plus his original 10. He has $110. Meanwhile, a whole bunch of us have gone down from $10 to $8. So you now have the $8 people, the $10 people, and then the 1%er right here who actually has the $110. A lot of inequality has now been generated. But where is the injustice? In other words, who's been cheated? Who's been deprived of their fair share? No one, as far as I can see, because we all voluntarily parted with our $2. Nobody forced us. Nobody put a gun to our head. So where is the injustice? Why is it the case that inequality per se, is unjust? Now, I grant that we are living today in a time of, well, the economist Schumpeter called it a gale of creative destruction. Capitalism goes through these phases, and they usually are phases of technological upheaval. The whole economy appears to be in flux, and there's a kind of vertigo that comes with that. The last time that happened was in the early 20th century. Most Americans lived on farms. And so a huge transition in which suddenly a small number of farmers, 5%, could feed not only the whole country, but pretty much the whole world. So what happens to all the other guys who worked on farms? What do you say to them? How do you protect their jobs? Actually, America did not protect their jobs. We have some token farm subsidies, but the basic message to those guys was, you got to get off the farm. You actually got to get up and go do something else. And so Americans, a little hardier in those days than now, did that. But you might say, well, wait a minute, well, why is it the case that these entrepreneurs, these CEOs, who fly around in private jets, what gives them the right to make so much? Not just inequality, but the magnitude of inequality in our society. Now, I want to suggest that the CEOs who make this kind of, let's call it filthy money, i.e. huge amounts of it, are actually a subset and a very special type of entrepreneur. They're actually supply-side entrepreneurs. And here's what I mean. When you take Economics 101, they teach you about supply and demand. And what business really does is it supplies demand. So people want food. And so you've got Safeway and Kroger's, and they supply food. And you want cars. And so you've got Ford and you've got Chrysler, they supply cars. But that's not actually where the big profits are. The big profits go to guys like Steve Jobs. Why? Because they don't actually supply anyone's demand. Nobody wrote letters to Steve Jobs and go, hey Steve, listen, I got this idea for a phone. You know what? It needs to have apps. It needs to be connected to the internet. It needs to do this, it needs to do that. No demand. Steve Jobs thought of it before there was a demand for it. He anticipated the demand. Then he didn't just think of it, because lots of us think of great ideas and do nothing about them. He then had to organize making it. He had to take all the risk. By the way, none of the Apple employees take any risk. Because if Apple has a bad quarter, Jobs can't go to them and go, hey, bad quarter, guys, give me half your paychecks back. Employees take no risk. They want a flat fee for what they do, and it's a one-time exchange. The entrepreneur doesn't do that. He gets paid at the end. So the point I'm trying to make is that Steve Jobs thought of the iPhone, he made it, he organized it, and he took all the risk and he put it on the market before you knew you couldn't live without it. That's the kind of guy who makes a huge pile of dough. But again, in what way has this guy, or any of the other guys, the guy who started Federal Express, the guy who came up with the idea of roll-on luggage, we should have thought of it. It was rather simple, but for decades people would go around lugging suitcases at the airport. Then one guy got the idea of putting little wheels on them. That guy probably made a fortune. But again, it was on the supply side because no one had a demand for it. He thought of it first. Now my point is, again, how are any of these guys, any of them, depriving you or me of our fair share? Isn't it true that in every single case, you had to get out of your car, get out of your house, go to the store, line up at Apple, and then go give them money to get your iPhone? And isn't it also true that if the iPhone cost twice as much, you'd still want to get one? In other words, you would pay far more than you actually do for this product. It's worth more to you than the $200 you paid for it. So at the end of the day, in what respect have you been cheated? You actually haven't. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that a lot of our outrage about the 1% and this and that, I think is fake. I think it's manufactured outrage. And actually it reflects, and human nature is very much like this. There are all kinds of studies about how we use a moral front to disguise the low emotions that actually drive us. So in fact, we're thinking, we would like to get our hands on some of that money. How do we do that? Now, it's kind of bad form to be a pickpocket. And it kind of lacks moral power to say, you have more money than I do. Do you mind if I reach into your wallet and take some of it? It sounds much better to go, you're exploiting the people. You're an evil capitalist. You're a member of the hated 1%. So in some senses, there's an effort here to create a morality that I don't even see exists. Now, to be fair, there have been sophisticated arguments made to defend progressive economic justice. The most sophisticated, in my view, is the argument of Marx. And Marx says, and I see a lot of other arguments building on this, Marx's basic idea is that the capitalist supplies capital. Every company is divided into capitalists and labor. And the capitalist supplies money. And Marx agrees. He says, money deserves a return. But the return is no more than the rate of interest. So if you put your money in the bank, you'll get 3%. So if someone is putting up capital for a business, pay the guy 3%. And then businesses have other costs. You have to rent facilities, and you need equipment, and you need to pay workers. And all of that is called the cost of doing business. But now Marx says, I notice that when businessmen sell a product, they don't just add up all the cost and charge that much. They charge as much as they can get away with. They charge as much as the market will bear. And so the money comes in, which is more than the cost of the business. There's a gap between what came in and what went out. Marx calls that surplus value. We call it profit. And Marx asks a very sophisticated question: who gets that? Now, Marx's whole assumption is that that belongs to the workers. It belongs to society. It doesn't belong to the capitalist. Why? Because the capitalist only supplied capital, and we already paid him. But as I just tried to show you a minute ago, Marx is actually, in my view, totally wrong. Because, in fact, capitalists don't typically supply capital. That's the one thing they don't supply. You think Steve Jobs put up his own money to make the iPhone? No, he went to a bank. He went to a venture capital firm. The real contribution of Jobs had far more to do with the idea for the business, the organization of the business, the assumption of risk, and Marx ignores all of that. He assumes that the workers made the product 100%, and that to me, well, I mean, I don't blame Marx a whole bunch because he didn't really work a day in his life. He was funded by Engels, and Engels inherited his money. I mean, these are basically the 100-year-ago versions of Bernie Sanders. They lived on their neighbor's couch, and, you know, this is Rip Van Winkle time. So enough for now about economic justice. I'll come back to that in the question-answer session if I have time. I want to pivot a little bit now and talk about racial justice. And this is something I've actually written about much of my career. I've written about affirmative action, multiculturalism, diversity. I don't actually want to rehearse all that, although I'm, again, happy to talk about it in questions. I actually want to talk about something else, which I think is almost a discovery of mine, and one that I'm going to be touching on in a film I'm releasing this summer, a film that's called Hillary's America, but the subtitle is The Secret History of the Democratic Party. And I want to talk about racial justice in a little bit of a new context, because for many years, a little bit as an immigrant, seeing America and seeing what America meant to me, I would then listen to attacks on America. America did this, America did that. Some years ago, I did a debate with Jesse Jackson at Stanford about, is America a racist society? And what was fascinating to me about the debate is that both of us were describing America, kind of like we're sitting in a restaurant and we are describing something we saw, like an accident, and we're giving totally different accounts of it. And I said to myself, what's going on here? I mean, Jesse Jackson and I, to hold up our hands, we're the same color. We're both living in the same country. Why don't we see things at least somewhat the same way? We might have some disagreements of interpretation, but how can we actually be giving such radically different accounts? And it occurred to me that the reason for this was because we were actually both using a completely different moral compass. I, as an immigrant, was using, I want to call it the historical or comparative standard. I'm comparing America to some other existing country. All immigrants do that. Jesse Jackson's never done that. He's not saying America, is horrible compared to. He's actually only comparing America to its own ideals. He's using, you could call it, the standard of the Garden of Eden. The utopian standard. So by that standard, America's always going to fall short, because we always fall short of perfection. So it occurred to me that the immigrant and the sort of indigenous minority were in two different situations, where we have two different types of lenses that we're putting on to look at America. And by the way, this is all important because you've got to keep in mind that when you chant for diversity, this is true diversity. In other words, people who actually see the world differently, not because they're lying or misinformed, but because they're bringing a whole background set of assumptions to the table that need to be taken into account. Because the background assumptions define the strength, but also the weakness of their position. If Jesse Jackson were to actually say, America is actually the best country in the world. It has the least prejudice. It has gone the longest distance to eliminate prejudice, but it falls short of perfection. Well, I think if that was Jesse Jackson's position, he would have to go get a real job. He would not be able to be a professional raceman just because it doesn't stir the blood. America's the best, but it's not perfect. So Jackson knows that. So he comes at it with he comes at it with a kind of inborn indignation that again, to someone who's grown up in a different culture, is a little difficult to fully identify with. But this is not exactly where I wanted to go. Where I wanted to go was this. For years I hear these indictments of America, and somewhat naively, I have gone on the defensive and tried to defend America against what I see as exaggerated attacks. And then, starting in the confinement center, I told you I was beginning to rethink some of my assumptions, rethink even some of my patriotism. And I began to read in a new light and began to say, let me look afresh at these accusations against America. America is a racist society. America relocated the Indians. America did segregation and Jim Crow and sterilization and the Ku Klux Klan and lynching. And the internment of the Japanese. And then I began to ask myself a question. All these things clearly happened in America, but who did them? America did them? The whole country got up and did these things? In fact, if you look at American history, clearly that's not the case. Clearly what happened in America is that there were huge fights about these things. There's a huge fight about slavery. Big civil war happened over that. 600,000 people died, 300,000 people on each side. So clearly, the statement that America did slavery is a little wanting in precision, to put it mildly. Now, I began to look at it more carefully, and you have to be careful about it because slavery, of course, is a very ancient institution. What's actually new about slavery in America it's not even that the founders made peace with slavery. The founders didn't really have a big choice in the matter. The founders wanted to create a union. Every single one of the states that got together in Philadelphia had slavery. It was not exactly easy to have a union and outlaw slavery at the outset. So the founders were in a pickle. But what's very unique and disturbing about American slavery is starting in the 19th century, the idea began to develop that slavery is actually a positive good. Slavery is good, not only for the master, it's good for the slave. It's to his benefit. Who came up with that? If you begin to look at it closely, you realize that that was an intellectual invention of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is the inventor of the idea of slavery as a positive good. Nowhere else in the world. There were slaves in ancient China and India and Greece and Rome, but most people defended slavery. Aristotle defends slavery as a function of necessity. Aristotle says there are some conditions in which you take people as captives in war, or there's dirty work to be done and there's got to be room for some people to do contemplation. So this is a regrettable necessity. But in the American South, you begin to have this idea of slavery as a positive good, an invention of the Democratic Party. Now you might say, wait a minute, this was an invention of the South. The South was the society that protected slavery. But then you have to explain why the Northern Democrats, led by Stephen Douglas, also protected slavery. And you have to explain why in the South, most people didn't own slaves, and 3/4 of people who fought on the Confederate side of the Civil War didn't own a single slave. They clearly weren't fighting for slavery. They might have been
fighting for something. So right away, the intellectual plot, you might say, thickens. And I put this out recently. We put out a trailer for our movie, and I put it out on social media, and people go, well, Dinesh, we all know this ancient history. Don't keep repeating the antebellum sins of the Democratic Party. And I said, well, all right, but what about the postbellum sins of the Democratic Party? Let me specify. After the Civil War, a group of Democrats got together and decided, let's kill the man who did this. And they assassinated Lincoln. And then the Republicans passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments,
all of which were vigorously resisted by the Democratic Party. If I'm correct, with the 14th and the 15th Amendment, not a single Democrat, either in the House or the Senate, voted for either one of those amendments. And then the Democrats established the following institutions: segregation, Jim Crow, the Ku Klux Klan, lynching, arson, night riding, murder. These were all institutions of deliberate subjugation invented by a single political party and opposed by the rival party. So you're saying, then you say to me, well, Dinesh, what are you saying? Are you saying that every segregation law was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, and upheld by Democratic mayors and sheriffs and police chiefs and city officials? And my answer is yes. That is exactly what I'm saying. That is exactly what I'm saying. So now we have a remarkable situation. Fast forward to our era. And by our era, I mean the era beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. And here we have a very cunning narrative that deserves a moment's attention. It's called the narrative of the big switch. The narrative of the big switch is that, yes, Dinesh, this all may be true. We can't actually rebut it. But we have an explanation for it. This is a little bit, by the way, like the lawyer. Notice how the lawyer says, my client didn't do it, but if he did, he was under duress. So the Democratic Party and the progressive movement say, we didn't do it, but now that you got us, that was not us. We switched. See, what happened in the 60s, Dinesh, is that the Democrats saw the light. They all became super enlightened, and they all became good guys. And they pushed through the Civil Rights Movement, as you know. Meanwhile, all the racists became Republicans. And that's why the South is Republican today, because the racists switched. Now, I have taken the trouble to make a list of approximately 1,200 of the Southern racists going back to the 1880s, but continuing through the 1960s. This is, by the way, a spectacular list. It includes multiple grand cyclopses of the Ku Klux Klan. It includes all the Dixiecrats. It includes an incredible list. Of this entire list, about 7 switched from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and all the rest lived and died as Democrats. Not only that, but when they died, they were lionized by the Democratic Party. When Harry Byrd, who was in the Ku Klux Klan, died, Clinton was at his funeral, Obama was at his funeral. They praised these guys as wonderful people, more. Clinton says, I'll even tell you why he was in the Klan. It was no big deal. That was the way to get ahead in the Democratic Party in West Virginia. A very revealing admission. And true, by the way. In the Democratic Party, you kind of had to be in the Klan in order to advance. So, why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this for a simple reason. By and large, your teachers won't. In other words, I'm telling you this because here it is, embedded in American history. Here it is, irrefutable fact if you take the trouble to check it out. But it is a very inconvenient fact for the whole progressive narrative. Why? Because the truth is that the Democratic Party has figured out a great scam. Take all the stuff that we did and blame it on America. America did it. No, America didn't do it. You did it. You did it. And then offer itself as the solution to the problem. In other words, the very guys who have poisoned the wells are now showing up as the water commissioner, as the solution to the problem. We need to have reparations. We? You do. What reparations have you made? What apologies has the Democratic... Even if it's the case that you used to be that way, when have you ever said so? Doesn't any process of moral conversion begin with a straightforward acknowledgement of what you've done and an apology for what you did, if not some restitution to the people you did it to? In other words, what I'm trying to say is that I'm making, if you realize it, a very different kind of conservative argument. I'm not defending America against these crimes. I'm saying they did occur. But I'm saying that we're pointing the finger of blame at the wrong people. Well, but the Republican Party at least opposed the Civil Rights Movement. Really, if you actually just Google the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Bill of 1968, percentage of Republicans who supported the Civil Rights Act, it's about 85%. Percentage of Democrats who supported the act, it's about 60%. And in fact, all the opposition to the civil rights laws was mounted by Democrats. None of it came from the Republican Party, and this is true of all the major civil rights laws of the 60s. Now, gee, Dinesh, we didn't really know this. And this brings me to this issue of diversity, because kind of where I'm going with all this is that at the core, to me, diversity isn't just about raising people's sensitivity, appointing counselors. This is multiculturalism on the surface. It's not real diversity. Real diversity actually digs under the surface and looks at what actually happened, how one actually does make restitution when wrongs have been done. It's kind of like what I said earlier. If you want a fair share, you need to give some thought to what is fair. What definition of fairness are you using? Are you actually applying it equitably to people? And this, I think, is not going on in the diversity movement. So my presence here is in a sense a certain kind of, I've been talking about big topics, and I can't hope to change your mind on them. And I'm not even trying to. What I'm actually trying to do is to present information, tidbits, that don't fit the prevailing narrative. Just to plant in your head the idea that this narrative is a little fishy. It's a little fishy. It doesn't really make sense. And there's a little bit of a scam underway. And so my job as a thinking person is not just to buy into it. I actually need to find the hardest kind of diversity, the diversity actually that's least available on this campus, which is, you might say, points of view that are true. I'm not just talking about shouting slogans or making extreme statements or just saying politically incorrect things to shock people. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm actually talking about legitimate debates about history and fairness and justice, without which any discussion of the topic is inherently shallow. So this is what I think is missing on the campus today. And I think this is what is impeding your education as very smart undergraduates. I went to Dartmouth, and I considered myself a smart guy, but there were 10,000 guys who applied to Dartmouth when I applied for 1,000 seats. My daughter's at Dartmouth now, but when she applied 2 years ago, there were 25,000 kids who applied for the same 1,000 seats. It's a lot harder to get into these colleges now. So I have no doubt that you are the cream of the crop. You're a very selective group of students, too selective in my opinion, to buy into the rubbish that I often see publicly passed off under the banner of diversity. So my message to you is, wake up, young man, or wake up, young woman. Don't take it received from the spoon. Even your teachers have an agenda, which I'm happy to talk about. But it's not that they're lying to you. It's not that they're lying to you. It just violates their progressive morality to spill the beans to you. And so what they do is they do their best to emit a squid-like cloud of rhetoric that fogs up the
wind. So the facts are actually there, but it's almost your job to put them together, and it's very hard to put them together because you have to do it all by yourself. And even the discussion that would enable you to learn from your peers is discouraged. It's immediately proclaimed to be against diversity. Oh, this Dinesh is coming to campus, he's against diversity. What does that even mean? I'm against diversity? I mean, what kind of nonsense is that? So, this is political correctness to me at its worst. It's not being able to call people names or any of that. No, I like to have a wide compass of free speech so that legitimate political debate can occur. And I hope that if there's one message you take from me today,
it is the importance of having that on the American campus. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna have a little Q&A session here. Kara here's gonna be holding the mic. So what we're gonna have you guys do, and that's the camera guy in the back here. Is it okay if they line up down the middle over here? Okay, so yeah, anybody who has questions, line up right down the middle here. Kara's gonna hold the mic, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna have a 30-second limit on questions, so that way we can get as many questions from as many people as possible. So try to be concise, and just go ahead and start lining up over here if you got questions.
Earlier, I just want to make a comment and express a statement that I thought of a while ago. Maybe it's not original in the world, but it's original with me. And when you said like the teachers and professors throw out the squid ink, and everything, the pieces are in there, but you can't really put it together. And I always like saying it's it's deception by false impression. And that's the statement that I like to use for so many things I hear on TV. And how somebody always wants to lead you off in a certain direction when they're not actually lying, but they're deceiving you by a false impression by how and what they state, what they do. So that was just a comment I wanted to make. Thank you.
I'll make a brief comment in return. I think this is something that I learned in the confinement center. I'd lie in my bunk bed and I'd listen to these convicts talk. And I realized that they actually talk about only 4 subjects: food, money, sleep, and sex. That's it. No other topics. And every other topic is interpreted through the lens of those 4 things. Now, initially I thought that this was really demonstrating a lack of the liberal education mentality, to be so narrow. But then I realized that there is actually more to it than we might think. In other words, most of us, and I am just as culpable of this, for 25 years I've written about American politics as if American politics is motivated by debate. We have in America 2 parties. One party believes in liberty, the other party believes in justice. The Republicans believe in equality of rights, and the liberals believe in equality of outcomes or equality of opportunity. And so here we go, this is the big debate. And then I realized that from the criminal underclass, their view is that no, that is a big intellectual smokescreen that very clever people put up. That in reality, American politics, and in fact all of human life, is motivated by things like acquisitiveness and greed and hatred and revenge and envy. And these are the actual human motives that clever people learn to submerge in order to make themselves the most morally wonderful people in the world. So, don't be fooled by that and learn to look at where people's real interests lie. This is the Machiavellian insight, to look below the surface. And that's part of being a wise guy, is to recognize that we should have the debate. I'll debate till the cows come home social justice. But I also realize that social justice can be a camouflage for other things that are masquerading as justice.
Hi, my name is Jason Morgan. I'm a PhD student here at the university. Thank you very much for coming and giving this talk. I wonder if in the course of your research you've done any work on Margaret Sanger, the eugenics movement, and its ties to the Democratic Party in the 1920s and 30s, and then the sort of progression of Democratic support for Planned Parenthood today, and Planned Parenthood being prevalent in minority neighborhoods in the United States today.
Right, so now here you go, putting your finger on another very explosive grenade. It's totally in our movie, and I'm writing about it now, but I didn't even mention it today. I wasn't even going to go there. But progressivism, modern progressivism, has actually had 2 very interesting phases. And the second phase has had to do major cleanup of the first phase. Because progressivism emerged in the early 20th century, and it was closely connected not exclusively, but closely connected with eugenics and social Darwinism. And the basic idea is that there are all these useless people in our society, and the best thing to do with them is to prevent them from existing in the first place. And so Margaret Sanger, people say, well, Margaret Sanger is a champion of birth control. You know, Hillary says that she got the Margaret Sanger Award a couple years ago. Margaret Sanger is a champion of birth control about limiting your reproduction. Actually, no. Margaret Sanger was not for limiting your reproduction. Margaret Sanger was for fit people having more kids and unfit people having fewer kids. In other words, some people should limit their reproduction, not all. By the way, the Nazis had the same view. The Nazi eugenics was based upon the idea that the Nordic Germans should have as many kids as possible and all kinds of subsidies to have more kids. Meanwhile, people who are gypsies and people who are immigrants and people who are mentally defective and people who are unfit, we have to wipe out their progeny. So when Margaret Sanger set up her so-called Negro Project, she'd hire all these black ministers, she'd pay them money to go in the black community. Today the progressives go, well, isn't this just wonderful? She's basically teaching people to space out their pregnancies. So what's going on here is there's a whole effort to take Margaret Sanger, erase the real Margaret Sanger, and put up this fake Margaret Sanger who can be an object of our common adulation. Now, the reason that all of this matters, I think, is there is a tendency in history when things turn out badly to go back and clean it up. So for example, in the 1930s, there was enormous admiration for Mussolini and a fair amount of admiration for Hitler. The young John F. Kennedy went to Germany in the 1930s, and he says, Hitler is a legend. He goes, Hitler's great. He goes, the truth of it is most people misunderstand Hitler, and the people who condemn the Nazis are just jealous of them. This is JFK. Then Mussolini was the favorite of FDR. FDR says, I really like Mussolini. I'm studying that man, and FDR dispatches a whole bunch of his New Dealers to Italy to study fascism. Because he goes, we aren't there yet. We need to learn from the fascists.